So the prospect of seizing Karg Island or seizing the 3 Iranian islands, including the island of Hormuz, which is right in the center of that narrow strait, this is not an easy or straightforward mission. There's some discussion about the United States sending in special forces teams to confiscate the 440 or so kilos of 60% enriched uranium. These are all, for one thing, operations that are extremely high risk. The Iranian capability has not been depleted as greatly as is being claimed.
Well, good evening, everyone. Jeff Steinberg has been with us now for 3 straight Fridays. Each time he comes prepared, and each time he's been right. Today is day 28 of the war with Iran, and that we're well past the 4-week mark that we were promised for this war. The situation has moved on in every axis since he was last with us. There's now a 15-point peace proposal on the table. It's a 10-day extension on a deadline that Iran's own mediators say that Iran never actually requested, and a second round of strikes on the Arak nuclear complex while diplomats were in mid-sentence. The question last week was whether there was anyone left to negotiate with, but this week the question is whether the negotiation itself is real or whether the strikes and the diplomacy can exist in the same sentence at the same time. Jeff knows how to read the difference between a deal in progress and a deal being used as cover. We brought him back to tell us which one we're watching. So Jeff, no pressure, but the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Great to be back. I think that there's an important question relative to the diplomatic front. There's no question that there is a diplomatic engagement. And remember that both the U.S., Israeli, and Iranian sides are engaging in wartime information warfare. And there's concern about the domestic constituents. So to my mind, there's confirmation that there is diplomatic engagement with a great big but attached to the end. The United States presented a 15-point proposal to the Iranians. If you read through the details of it, it was basically a demand by the United States for unconditional surrender by the Iranians. There were very little concessions involved. The Iranians did respond almost immediately and presented their own 5-point conditions for bringing an end to the war, and their conditions were equally unconditional surrender demands on the United States and Israel. So while there is quote unquote diplomacy going on, I think the important question is who has the greatest interest in bringing this to an end sooner than later? And in that regard, I think all indications point that it's far more important for Donald Trump to bring this war to an end sooner than later. The United States is facing a kind of a critical decision. The 5-day extension has now been extended another series of days until April 6th. So we've got a little over another week. And there are some people, including I'm sure many people in the leadership in Iran, who believe that this whole diplomatic pause is merely a cover for the U.S. launching a surprise attack. And the problem for the United States is that from the outset, the expectation, both in Washington and in Tel Aviv, was that this would be a relatively quick action, 3-4 weeks at the absolute most, but the expectation was that it would be over in several weeks and that you would see joyful Iranians taking to the street and overthrowing the Islamic Republic once the Revolutionary Guard and Basij militia had been sufficiently weakened. If you look in the 2003 Iraq invasion, a ground invasion was built into the plan from day one. And so there was a pre-staging of several 100,000 American troops in the region. And right after the initial shock and awe, the next stage was a multi-flank ground invasion. In this case, there was no expectation of a need for a ground invasion. And only 3.5 weeks into the process are we now seeing a deployment of two Marine groups of about 2,500 soldiers each, the Rapid Response Force from the 82nd Airborne, and both Army and Marine Special Forces units are all being called up with the prospect of coming into the region.
Jeff, sorry to interrupt you, but that I heard was they're actually the Navy's deploying these autonomous GARC drone boats in the Straits of Hormuz, which is a new thing, right?
Yeah. So I think the options that the United States is facing, if the Iranians see no reason to agree to an end to the war on something like terms that the U.S. could accept, the U.S. is now put in the position of, well into the process, having to deploy ground forces on a limited scale. One obvious target is Kharg Island, which, for people not familiar with it, it's the depot from which about 90% of Iranian oil is exported. It is not in the Straits of Hormuz, but is considerable distance north of there. And so the prospect of seizing Kharg Island or seizing the 3 Iranian islands, including the island of Hormuz, which is right in the center of that narrow strait, this is not an easy or straightforward mission. There's some discussion about the United States sending in special forces teams to confiscate the 440 or so kilos of 60% enriched uranium. These are all, for one thing, operations that are extremely high risk. The Iranian capability has not been depleted as greatly as is being claimed. I think the evidence of that has been their ability to retaliate with tit-for-tat strikes every time there's been a major strike against Iranian targets. I was mentioning to you before we started the discussion that I received an article that was written by a senior retired Israeli Defense Force colonel, who's also one of Israel's leading experts on the Arab world. And his view is that there is a very real prospect that the U.S. will look for some sort of opportunity to bring this to an end, because the United States is concerned about global inflation, about significant damage that's already been done to the energy infrastructure in the Gulf countries. Israel, we don't have a really clear picture of how much damage is being incurred, but U.S. military specialists believe that the inventory of Patriot and the intercept missiles for the THAAD systems have been largely burned through. In the first 3 days of the war, the United States deployed 900 Patriot missiles, and the U.S. production capacity is only 800 missiles a year. And so we're depleting inventories in places like North Korea or South Korea and other areas. You're having an impact on the Ukraine war because there is virtually a cutoff of the supplies into the Ukrainian forces. And so, as you had indicated earlier, we're tiptoeing in the direction of a much larger conflict, not just restricted to this targeting of Iran. Israel has made it clear that in their combat against Hezbollah, their intention is to completely take over and permanently annex southern Lebanon south of the Litani River. And right now they're in the process of carrying out carpet bombing of that area, not just targeting Hezbollah positions, but targeting all of the towns and villages south of the Litani River to make them uninhabitable. So you've got a population flowing north into exile north of the Litani River. And so you've got that extension. The settlers have been clearly given the green light to launch a major escalation across the entire West Bank, carrying out one day this past week attacks on 13 separate towns and villages, Palestinian towns and villages, in one single day. That's not something that's simply a coordination of the settlers' militias. That's something being coordinated with the Netanyahu government, particularly with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And you've got an escalatory pattern in the Ukraine-Russia war, where the Ukrainians are relying heavily on British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles. I just got a report from somebody who closely monitors the internal press and think tanks inside Russia that there are deep strikes on a regular basis, both missile and drone strikes, deep into the interior of Russia, which are targeting specific energy nodes and the country's power grid. These attacks cannot be carried out by the Ukrainians without either British or American target acquisition, satellite data, and the rest. So your point about this expanding into a much larger theater of engagement with the prospect of other countries, including major powers like Russia, being drawn in, with the depletion of resources in the Asia-Pacific region, what is that telling Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership about the prospect of this being a right moment for making a move on Taiwan? We don't know the answers to those questions per se, but we do know that there are consequences now extending outside the region. The Straits of Hormuz used to be a free flow area, but as the Iranians have said, Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, the former IFGC Air Force officer, things will never return to what they were beforehand in the Straits of Hormuz. Countries that are being allowed to transit through the safe corridor running along the Iranian coast to bring oil supplies out of the Straits of Hormuz, mainly to targets in Asia, India, China, Japan, are paying a $2 transit fee, a $2 million transit fee. So the Straits of Hormuz have gone from being an open area to a toll road. And it's not clear that'll ever return to a different situation. And so all of these things are piling up in a way that will have severe consequences. There are issues related to global supply chains, because the region is a major source of not just oil and gas, but plastic, fertilizer, and other vital materials for the running of a modern economy. So I think that we're at yet another inflection point where extremely difficult decisions are going to have to be made in Washington. And obviously, we're seeing now, we talked about this last week, but an even further deepening of the split between Washington and Tel Aviv over the ultimate objectives of the war. For the United States, stability in the region, a return to stability, a reopening of the Straits of Hormuz, dealing with the inflationary and supply chain factors is critical. And Trump is prepared to negotiate with somebody in the current existing structure, because the prospects of regime change have been greatly reduced since the optimistic opening days of this. And so basically, I think that from the U.S. standpoint, coming up with some kind of a negotiated agreement, there will be talks in Pakistan sometime over the next few days. So it's been confirmed that, in fact, there are lines of diplomatic communication. They're probably more indirect than direct, but there are a number of parties in the region, Pakistan, Turkey in particular, that can serve as that. From the Israeli standpoint, they want regime change or a major destruction of Iran that will deliver a long-term benefit to Israel's security concerns within the region. So that divergence is another thing that I think is emerging as a factor, and how much influence Trump can exert on Netanyahu and vice versa. So this weekend, there are some people, Ambassador Chas Freeman was interviewed earlier today or last night, and said that with the Marine units arriving in the region as of this morning, with the 82nd Airborne capable of being in the region within 18 hours at most, he thinks that there may very well be a ground escalation, a special forces type ground escalation on the part of the United States, obviously with Israel's support, this weekend. So we are at a point where there's the diplomatic track and then there's the escalatory track. And nobody can say with certainty, outside of a very few handful of people in Washington, whether or not we're going to see diplomacy given a chance or whether that's another feign in order to achieve an element of surprise for the military operation.
But Jeff, let me ask you this. There's a couple other dimensions of this, especially as we talk about a kind of a widening conflict. The first development that really I think we saw, which really surprised me, was to see the IDF Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, warning the Security Cabinet this week that the IDF would collapse in on itself. I think that's a direct quote if the troop shortage isn't addressed. And he said that their shortage is about 15,000, and he called for conscription legislation and in a call-up of the reserves, extended mandatory service. So you touched on this a little bit, but that's a pretty dramatic statement coming from within Israel, isn't it?
I think that internally the Israelis are a lot more frank about the situation than the versions that we hear in the United States. I think it's important to remember that the IDF has been engaged in continuous warfare on multiple fronts since October of 2023. And you know far better than I that sustaining a level of combat readiness and for that long a period of time, and of course there were earlier periods where the war extended into Lebanon as well, but now we're looking at a really full-scale Lebanon war. And as I say, there's clearly an intent to move towards annexation and expansion, at least of the West Bank, maybe again, parts of Gaza. So this is an extraordinary drain. We also do not know what the morale factor is. The opposition, the popular opposition to the Netanyahu government is enormous, and that includes within the ranks of military reservists. They had problems with reservists refusing to be called up at certain points during the Gaza war. And there are clear indications that the level of damage being done by Iranian missiles and drones to targets in Israel is far greater than has been allowed to come out publicly. There's a wartime censorship and a ban on anyone providing detailed and accurate information on the level of damage inside Israel. And so that's another factor. It used to be that people would use TikTok as a kind of a means of getting out quick video footage that could give the world a kind of an eyes and ears picture of what was going on. But we know TikTok has been purchased by a close Trump ally who's also a very strong Netanyahu ally. So that channel of information coming out of Israel has been largely shut down. So we can see glimmers. The fact that the Iranians were able to launch a strike directly into the town of Dimona, right where the Israelis have their major nuclear weapons complex, is an indication that there's more going on. And with the depletion of Patriot and THAAD intercept missiles and similar situation with Israel's Iron Dome, which is not capable of intercepting drones in the first place. We don't know the extent to which Iran has the ability to maintain targeted fire into Israel. So this is a unique and probably more existential situation for Israel. And Israel's targeted assassinations of all of the potential pragmatists within all of the Iranian leadership factions has basically further consolidated control by the most hardline factions of the IRGC and the most hardline clerical elements that are really assets of IRGC and not independent theologians.
Yeah.
And that includes Mojtaba Khamenei.
And we haven't seen him at all, have we?
No. One could say his status is unclear. On the other hand, it would make good sense given the ability of the Israelis to target and identify and assassinate leaders to keep the handful of really important people in positions where they're not accessible. So again, there's a lot of big question marks. You could come up with a long list of unknowns in the situation, which are defining factors in terms of where this is headed.
Well, and the other thing too, Jeff, that we'd been hearing rumors about Russia providing information to Iran, and then just this week, the UK Defense Minister John Healey stated that British intelligence had assessed that Russia not only provided Iran with intelligence during the conflict, but they trained Iranian forces before it all began. And he saw this, and what he said, I think his quote was, they've seen the hidden hand of Putin behind Iran's operations. And so that's also been echoed by the EU foreign policy chief. And they've basically said that Russia has been helping Iran with intelligence to target and kill Americans, supplying drones for use against the Gulf states. And so they've been actively collaborating with Iran too, which a much wider role than we had ever even previously thought.
But I think that the Europeans are being intentionally dramatic. The main channel between Russia and Iran for years has been the IRGC. And there are Russians who've been in Iran on training missions going back for years. It's kind of part of the strategic partnership between Russia and Iran that's been signed for a number of years and is a long-term strategic partnership. I think that the Europeans are doing certain things that are intended to make sure that Trump doesn't bring this thing to an end before there's been something a lot more damaging to Iran. I'll give you an example. The Europeans immediately picked up on claims that were made by the Israelis that the Iranians fired an intercontinental ballistic missile at Diego Garcia last week, and that this demonstrated that they had a deployable capability that ran 4,000 kilometers, meaning Berlin, Paris, and London were in the target range. The Russians came out, as did the Chinese separately, and said that they had tracked the trajectory of that missile, and it was not fired from Iran, but was fired from a submarine much closer into Diego Garcia, and they believed that it was an Israeli submarine. So you're also dealing with, I have no confirmation of that, but I do know that the U.S. was very hesitant to draw the conclusion that the Iranians now had a 4,000 kilometer missile, because U.S. intelligence had been following that for years and years and knew that the original Ali Khamenei had placed a restriction on Iranian missiles to only travel between 2,000 and 2,500 to assure Europe and the United States that they were not looking for broader targets outside of their regional deterrence.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tricky. It's very tricky. And
that's a good descriptor, and today Rubio said that the war ends in weeks, not months, which I thought was an interesting statement. And then the president floated seizing Iran's oil as an option, but he wouldn't get into any of the details. Jeff, what do you think the military end state is for the U.S. for this war to end? Do you have any kind of picture of that?
I think that it's a first and foremost political consideration. The larger issues of the supply chain disruption, the energy shortages, the inflation of not just energy prices, but if you think about it, jet fuel is now at a record price. And it means that a lot of commercial goods that are transported by air are going to also have basically a higher risk premium attached to them. So I think at any moment, Trump is infinitely capable of stating in grandiose terms how successful the operation has been, whether that's the reality or not. And so I think, again, that the U.S. is looking to bring this thing to an end because a lot of the unforeseen consequences and collateral damage have already materialized. Support for the war domestically is at a low point. So I think we're going to see whether or not the ground phase of this operation occurs, it's not a full-scale ground invasion for regime change, but they might target Karg Island. And that is the place where Iranian oil goes out onto the world market.
Well, Jeff, thanks so much for all of your analysis. It's, as always, incredibly interesting and insightful. And so 4 weeks in, here we are. The picture looks like this. You have this diplomatic channel that the two sides describe in totally incompatible terms. Strikes on nuclear facilities during the week those diplomatic channels were actually opened. A Navy commander was killed on the Iranian side, as I recall, as well. The strait is now down to about 6 ships a day. Oil is above $110 a barrel. The IDF chief is telling his cabinet the force is heading for collapse. Russia's providing training and targeting intelligence to the adversary, and 3,000 people are dead across the region, with that number still going up. So that's not an endpoint, as you said, Jeff. That's an inflection point. But very grateful for your analysis. 4 weeks running now, and we'll do it again next week. So thank you, Jeff.
It was good. Look forward. Hope we'll have some better news about an endpoint.
That would be good.
Yes.
Can't you give us some good news, Jeff?
Yankees won their opening game.
Well, there you go. Thanks for that. All right. Well, tonight's full session is going to go into the archive here within the next several hours, and you'll all have a chance to listen to it. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. This is the Heroes Path podcast. I'm John Fenzel. Stay sharp, stay grounded, and lead well. Thank you very much.